Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into a really interesting puzzle in the world of sustainability reporting. We often hear companies talk about big, broad topics, things like their impact on biodiversity or water use. But what actually happens when two totally different industries, let's say farming and mining, use the exact same word to describe their impact? Well, it turns out that one word can be hiding two completely different worlds.
Okay, think about this for a second. You have a farm which grows food from the earth, and you have a mine which pulls minerals out of it. Both of them obviously have a huge effect on the natural world, but does it really make any sense for them to report on those effects using the same cookie-cutter approach? It sounds like a simple question, doesn't it? But the answer, well, it gets right to the heart of what makes sustainability reporting genuinely meaningful, instead of just a slick PR move.
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at how one topic can have totally different impacts depending on the industry. Then, we'll introduce the framework built to handle this exact problem, the GRI standards. From there, we'll do a deep dive on one shared topic, biodiversity, and really compare the footprint of farming versus mining. And finally, we'll see how it all comes together to make sure companies report on what actually matters.
All right, let's get right into it. Section 1, this whole idea that a single topic can mean very different things in the real world. This is really the key to understanding everything else we'll talk about today.
Just think about it with the topic of water use. When a big farming company talks about water, they're probably talking about irrigation, maybe drawing water from rivers or aquifers to cover huge areas of land. But when a mining company talks about using water, they might mean using it to control dust or process ore, which is often a much more localized but super intensive process. See? The label water use is the same, but the story behind it, the actual impact, couldn't be more different. And that's exactly why a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work.
So how do you solve a problem like that? How do you compare these different impacts without just, throwing everything into one generic bucket? Well, that's where the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, comes in. They created a whole framework of standards to do just that. The way the GRI framework is set up is actually pretty clever. It's got 3 layers. At the bottom, you've got the universal standards. These are the basics, the rules of the road that apply to everyone. Then you've got topic standards, which give you all the nitty-gritty details on specific issues like carbon emissions or waste. But that middle layer, that's the magic ingredient for us today. These are the sector standards. They act like a special lens, recognizing that what's most important for, say, an oil and gas company is going to be way different than what's important for a fishing fleet.
And this isn't just a friendly suggestion either. GRI makes it a mandatory requirement. If there's a sector standard for your industry, you have to use it, period. This forces companies to report on the impacts that are most likely to be significant for them, and it stops them from just picking and choosing the easy topics to talk about. It really proves that when it comes to credible reporting, context is everything.
Okay, so now let's really put this framework to the test. We're going to take that one really important shared topic, biodiversity, and see how two very different, high-impact sectors are expected to report on it. Let's compare agriculture and mining.
So first things first, let's make sure we're all on the same page. This is the official GRI definition of biodiversity. And as you can see, it's not just about, counting cute animals. It's about the entire complex web of life, from genetics inside a single species to the differences between species, all the way up to the health of entire ecosystems. It's crucial for everything, from the food we eat to a stable climate. So yeah, when a company says it's impacting biodiversity, the stakes are unbelievably high.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, because this is the core difference. On the one hand, with agriculture, the impact is all about intensity. The bigger the farm, the more industrial the practices, the more biodiversity tends to suffer. But on the other hand, with mining, the impact is about severity and permanence. A mine physically and permanently changes a landscape in a way that's often just irreversible. The very nature of the impact is different, even though they both fall under that same biodiversity umbrella. So let's dig into that first category, shall we? We'll start with the specific footprint of the agriculture, aquaculture, and fishing sectors on the natural world.
So what does that look like in practice? Well, you've got the obvious one, converting natural habitats, like clearing a forest to plant crops. Then there's monoculture, where you plant these huge fields of just one single crop, which just wipes out local biodiversity. You also have pesticide use, which can be devastating for non-target species like bees and other pollinators, plus all the pollution from fertilizer runoff that messes with our rivers and lakes. It's a whole collection of interconnected issues.
And the consequences of all this? They are absolutely staggering. Just to give you one example, data cited by GRI shows that around 40% of invertebrate pollinator species, we're talking bees, butterflies, the insects that help grow our food, are facing extinction. 40%. That single number really shows you how these agricultural practices can have these huge ripple effects across entire ecosystems that we all depend on.
Okay, now let's completely switch gears and look at the other side of our coin, the unique and very different mark that the mining sector leaves on our planet.
For mining, the drivers look a lot different. Here, you're talking about clearing massive areas of land, not just for the mine pit itself, but for all the roads and buildings needed to support it. This shatters habitats, permanently breaking them into little pieces. Mining also uses incredible amounts of water, and it can create long-lasting pollution problems, like acid mine drainage, which can poison water sources for decades or even centuries.
And this, right here, is probably the biggest difference. While you could, in theory, return a farm to a more natural state over time, the impact of a mine is often forever. That giant hole in the ground, the massive piles of waste rock called tailings, the potential for contamination, that environmental legacy can last for generations, long after the mine has closed down.
So we've got these two totally different sets of impacts, which brings us to the big payoff. How does this all translate into what companies are actually expected to report? This is where you really see the power of those sector standards in action.
Just take a look at this table. It lays it all out perfectly. For agriculture, the core concern is the intensity of its operations. So the reporting focuses on things like pesticide management, making sure farmed fish don't escape, and disclosing every single species that gets caught, including bycatch. But for mining, the core concern is the severity of that landscape alteration. So they're expected to report on biodiversity changes at every single mine site. Notice the linked topics too. Agriculture is linked to things like soil health. Mining is linked to waste, tailings management, and mine closure. Every single disclosure is tailored to the unique reality of that industry. And that is the absolute key takeaway. Meaningful reporting isn't about just checking a generic box that says biodiversity. It's about giving real, specific, relevant information on the actual impacts your business has. For a fishing company, that means talking about bycatch. For a mining company, that means talking about habitat restoration. It's about what really matters.
And this is just so important. Without this kind of sector-specific detail, it's way too easy for a company to publish a beautiful report talking about how much they love biodiversity while completely ignoring the most damaging parts of their operations. This tailored approach forces a much more honest and difficult conversation. It's the difference between real transparency and just marketing.
Which brings us right to our final thought for today. We just went super deep on one single topic, biodiversity, in just 2 sectors, and the level of detail is pretty incredible, right? So the next time you pick up one of those generic sustainability reports that's full of broad, feel-good statements, maybe ask yourself, if this is the level of detail a serious framework expects, what critical information am I not being told? What's the real story hiding behind those vague words?